History is often written in broad, sweeping strokes: the rise and fall of empires, the movement of armies, the establishment of massive religious institutions. But beneath those large movements, there are often quieter, more personal currents that run through the centuries. One of those currents is the story of the individuals who lived on the edges of two worlds, specifically those from the Jewish community who found their way into the Christian faith. In his book, Some Jewish Witnesses for Christ, Aaron Bernstein attempts to trace this often overlooked thread through history. He isn't just writing a list of names, he's trying to map out a remnant, a persistent, though often obscured, group of people who bridged the gap between Judaism and Christianity from the earliest days of the Church through the modern era. To understand this movement, Bernstein starts at the very beginning, in the Apostolic Age. This was a time when the lines between being Jewish and being a follower of Jesus were not as sharply defined as they would become later. In these early centuries, thousands of Jews joined the burgeoning Christian movement. For many of them, this wasn't a total abandonment of their heritage. They often maintained their Jewish identity, their customs, and even their social structures, even as they adopted Greek names to navigate the wider Roman world. It was a period of intense intellectual and social exchange, where the roots of the faith were being nourished by deeply Jewish thought and practice. However, that fluidity didn't last forever. Bernstein points to a pivotal moment in the 5th century, the codification of the Babylonian Talmud. This was a monumental event for Judaism, but for the relationship between Jews and Christians, it acted as a sort of great partition. The establishment of this central authoritative body of Jewish law and tradition created a rigid religious and social divide. It made the two communities more distinct and, in many ways, more separated than they had been in the centuries prior. As the boundaries hardened, the act of conversion became a much more significant, and often more controversial, life event. Yet, even as the partition grew, Bernstein notes that Jewish converts didn't just disappear into the background. In many eras, these individuals became vital voices within the Christian movement, often using their intimate knowledge of Jewish law and tradition to defend their former co-religionists against anti-Semitic accusations or to explain the Jewish roots of the Christian faith to a skeptical world. As we move into the medieval period, the book takes us on a journey through different cultural landscapes, looking at how this process of conversion played out in both the East and the West. In the Eastern traditions, the stories are often deeply personal and sometimes quite dramatic. Bernstein highlights the life of Alexeyev, a Russian soldier. His story is one of profound transformation. After years of resisting the faith, he experienced a personal crisis involving his health, losing the use of his legs, which eventually led him to embrace orthodoxy. He didn't just convert, he became a prolific author and a defender of Jewish customs, using his unique position to bridge the two worlds. Another fascinating figure from this era is Gregory Bar, Hebrew Iiisixus, a 13th century Syrian polymath. He was a man of immense learning, a scholar who could move seamlessly between Jewish, Samaritan, and Christian thought. His life illustrates a kind of intellectual synthesis that was rare, showing how a single mind could grasp the complexities of multiple traditions at once. In the West, the experience was quite different. Bernstein distinguishes between the intense, often aggressive missionary zeal of the pre-Reformation era and the more complicated, often forced or clandestine conversions that occurred in the post-Reformation period. The history of conversion in Western Europe is a heavy one, marked by social pressure and political upheaval. The book mentions the Domus Conversorum in London, an institution established to provide support for Jewish converts in English society. It serves as a historical marker of how the state and the church sought to institutionalize the process of integration, for better or for worse. The landscape shifted again with the Protestant Reformation. This was a massive turning point for the relationship between these two faiths. Bernstein argues that the Reformation actually removed several significant liturgical barriers that had previously made conversion difficult for Jews. One of the biggest issues was the use of images in Christian worship. For many Jews, the use of icons and statues was a major stumbling block, seen as a violation of the commandment against graven images. When the Protestant movements moved toward a more iconoclastic or image-free style of worship, the cultural and theological distance between Judaism and Protestantism actually narrowed in some ways. This era produced some very striking individual stories. One of the most moving is that of Rabbi Abraham. His conversion wasn't the result of a theological debate or a political maneuver, but a simple act of human connection. He was a traditional rabbi who encountered a starving man and, moved by compassion, offered him hospitality. That simple encounter, rooted in the Jewish value of welcoming the stranger, became the catalyst for a profound spiritual transformation. But perhaps the most prominent figure Bernstein profiles from this period is Michael Solomon Alexander. His story is one of intense internal struggle. He was a highly educated Jewish teacher and a successful businessman, a man with everything to lose. His journey began when he started studying the Gospel of John. What followed was a period of deep, agonizing spiritual conflict. Ultimately, he chose to leave his lucrative career and his social standing behind to become a missionary. He eventually moved to the Holy Land and served as the first Protestant bishop in Jerusalem, a role that bridged his Jewish heritage and his new Christian calling in a very literal, geographical sense. As we look back at these stories, several themes begin to emerge that help make sense of this long, complicated history. One of the most central ideas is what Bernstein calls the remnant concept. Throughout the centuries, there has been a continuous, if often unnamed, population of Jewish believers. Because they were often the minority within both their original community and their new one, they frequently slipped through the cracks of mainstream history. They weren't always the leaders or the famous theologians. Often, they were the quiet individuals whose lives were shaped by these transitions, but whose presence nonetheless influenced the direction of the faith. This brings us to the tension at the heart of the history of conversion, the distinction between conviction and pressure. It is impossible to look at this history without acknowledging the darker side, the conversions that were driven by social coercion, political pressure, or even clandestine abductions. These were not choices made in a vacuum. They were often survival strategies in a world that could be extremely hostile to outsiders. Yet, alongside those stories are the stories of people like Michael Solomon, Alexander, or Rabbi Abraham, individuals whose transitions were driven by a deep, personal, and often painful sense of conviction. Distinguishing between these two types of conversion is essential to understanding the true complexity of the phenomenon. Another significant theme is the role of intellectual synthesis. We often think of religion as a set of boundaries, but the people described in this book often acted as bridges. These Jewish converts didn't simply discard their old knowledge, they brought it with them. They used their deep understanding of Hebrew scripture, the nuances of the Torah, and the intricacies of Jewish law to strengthen and refine Christian theology. This wasn't just about changing one set of beliefs for another, it was about a profound intellectual exchange that helped shape the way Christian theology developed, particularly in how it understood its own relationship to the Hebrew Bible. The Reformation's impact on this dynamic is a perfect example of how cultural shifts can change the rules of religious identity. By simplifying the liturgy and removing the focus on visual icons, the Reformation changed the very atmosphere of what it meant to be a Christian. This made the transition less about adopting a completely different aesthetic and more about a shift in theological focus, which, as we saw with the case of Michael Solomon Alexander, allowed for a different kind of engagement with the text. As the book moves toward its conclusion, it illustrates the truly global reach of these individual journeys. It isn't just a European or Middle Eastern story. The thread of Jewish testimony to the Christian faith can be found in families across the globe, from the established communities of Europe to the Falasha community in Abyssinia. It is a story that spans continents and centuries, showing that this movement was not a localized phenomenon, but a global one. In the end, Bernstein's work leaves us with a picture of a history that is much more layered than the standard textbooks suggest. It is a history of individuals navigating the intense pressures of their time, often caught between the traditions of their ancestors and the call of a new faith. Whether through intense intellectual study, sudden spiritual encounters, or the slow process of social integration, these people left a mark on the religious landscape of the world. They were the witnesses, some famous, many unknown, who lived out the tension between two worlds. Their stories remind us that history isn't just made by the institutions that survive, but also by the individuals who move between them, carrying their heritage with them even as they embrace something new. It is a quiet, persistent history, a remnant that continues to offer a window into the complex human reality of faith and identity.